Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and before we go any further, please subscribe. Click on the button on the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe to our channel. And once you do that, we can all move on with our lives and enjoy the rest of this video. Today, I'm going to be having a top 5, you heard it right, not a top 10, a top 5. Top 5 favorite Wild West themed board games. Yeehaw! Rootin' Tootin' time we're gonna have today. So, Wild West theme is a theme that's always appealed to me. I'm not so much so about the very serious, old westerns, but just that kind of like caricature of the romanticized Wild West experience. Especially the humorous aspects of it as well has always appealed to me. In different media, movies, TV shows, cartoons even, comics, and so on and so forth. And I find that in the board game hobby, it's also been very captivating for me. There's something about the Wild West theme that kind of lends itself to many of the mechanisms in board games that I appreciate. So yeah, because of the Wild West nature of things and how wild things were, right? There is a little bit of confrontation and conflict and things like that. But there's a lot of other neat things that are going on, like the expansion of cities, accumulation of gold, just the expanding westward and, keeping track of your cattle. I don't know. There's just so many neat things that are involved in this Wild West theme that, again, I've enjoyed in lots of the board games. Now, one of the reasons why I'm doing a top 5 today as opposed to a top 10 is because I have not played 10 Wild West themed games, even though there's many games out there, I'll get to that later, that I do not own yet and I haven't played yet that I'm hoping to play that are Wild West themed. I've only played 7. So I am going to go into my top 5, but before I do, I will give a brief honorable mention to 2 of those games that did not make it into the top 5 proper. And the first game I'm going to mention here is Revolver, and this is designed by Mark Chaplin and published by Stronghold Games. And Revolver is a 2-player only game where players are taking asymmetric sides. One player is the lawman, the other player is the outlaws, and you're basically playing cards along these 5 different regions and comparing them back and forth to trigger some sort of combat. And as you resolve combat, different players lose cards and face casualties. And both players have opposing end game conditions, right? The outlaws are trying to advance through these different regions. There's like a little track along the different regions, and they're trying to advance to the final spot, which is basically the train, which will be their getaway, right? And that's how they escape. While the lawman is trying to kill one by one each member of the main outlaws posse, and the posse is like about 20 characters including a dog, and ultimately killing the main guy, the leader of the posse, because until you kill the leader of the posse, the game isn't over. And once you've killed all these posse members plus their leader, then the game is over and the lawmen have won. So again, you have these asymmetric sides. Works really neat, very simple mechanically speaking. It reminds me a little bit about Battle Line, where you have the different areas that you're vying for control, and the lawmen don't necessarily have a card limit, but the bad guys, the outlaws, they do have a 3-card limit in each individual region. So playing them and choosing which one you'll play is interesting. Some neat, interesting special abilities triggered by different cards. And a lot of Wild West flavor, a lot of Wild West theme comes out in some of these cards in this game. Fun game. Nothing to write home about necessarily, but fun if you're in that Wild West feel or that Wild West mode and you want to play with another player. Then my other honorable mention is Flick 'em Up. And as the name indicates, this is a flicking game, Wild West themed game, where players are forming 2 teams. There's 2 teams. You can have anywhere from 2 to 10 players. So each team can be made up of anywhere from 1 to 5 players. And each team has 5 characters. And no matter how many players are in each team, all 5 characters are going to be used. And again, you got 2 sides. You have the lawmen and you have the outlaws. And this game is a scenario-based game where the main rule book comes with about 8 different scenarios. You choose a scenario, you set up the town accordingly. There's about 6 buildings in the town and you place them accordingly. You have a couple other features like cacti and haystacks and wooden barrels and so on and so forth. And players are flicking their pieces, their character pieces, along the town, trying to maneuver themselves and position themselves to ultimately end up in gun combat or dueling with their opponents. And the way they execute this is by getting this disc, this little disc that represents their player pieces as they move it, and then they put back their player pieces, but also this other disc that represent their bullets, and they aim and they try to knock down their opponents. And to successfully wound an opponent, you cannot just hit them. Like the bullet has to do more than just make contact with them. It actually has to knock the piece down, and it could only ricochet. Doesn't really count, so it cannot ricochet off one character and hit two more characters and kill both of them. It only the first character that it actually makes contact with will suffer the casualty. But it just causes damage, and each character has a certain amount of health, and eventually they'll die. And again, each scenario has a different endgame trigger, a different amount of rounds. You have the town hall, which is a clock, and is also a track of how many rounds, because after a certain amount of rounds, the game is over. Really cool, fun game, light. It's just a kind of like silly game. It's really, you got to have the right group to get this game down. But when you do get this game down, it can create some laughs and some fun, memorable moments. And now we will move on to the actual top 5. And the first one I'm going to mention here is probably many people's #1 Wild West themed game, and that's Bang the Dice game. And this game here is known for replacing its bigger brother, the card game, which was too long and too complex for what it was. This is a much simpler, lighter, lighthearted, fun, almost party style game, which accommodates 2 to 8 players without an expansion. And in this game, each player is taking on a role. One player is the sheriff, and everybody knows who the sheriff is. And then there's either 1 or 2 deputies who are the allies of the sheriff, depending on the player count. There are 2 or maybe 3 outlaws, depending on the player count. And there's 1 or 2 renegades, depending on the player count. And each of these characters or each of these teams have a different end game objective, right? The sheriff is just trying to outlive and outlast everybody. The deputy is trying to stay undercover so that nobody knows quite who the deputy is, right? So he can live long enough to help the sheriff and basically help the sheriff survive. Even if the deputy loses, if the sheriff wins the game, theoretically, the deputy won along with the sheriff. Then you've got the outlaws, and the goal of the outlaws is point blank, kill the sheriff. If the outlaws can kill the sheriff, the game is over and they've won. And finally, you've got the renegade. And the renegade's the trickiest one of all, because the renegade kind of wants to blend in. He wants to look like an outlaw, but he also kind of wants to look like a deputy. He definitely doesn't want people to know he's the renegade, because the renegade can only win if he or she is the last person standing with the sheriff and then kills the sheriff. That can be very hard to accomplish. So this game is neat. A lot of social deduction, taking all the available information, the decisions that people are making, the timing of their decisions, their body language, what they verbally communicate. Mind you, this is also a Yahtzee style game, so the core mechanism is just rolling 5 dice, and you get up to 2 re-rolls. So basically 3 rolls in total, similar to Yahtzee and some other Yahtzee type games like King of Tokyo or Roll Through the Ages. And then finally, you have to settle after your 3rd roll. You have to settle for what you have and execute those actions. And it's interesting because you do have a dynamite side of the die, which locks that die whenever you roll it. And if you roll 3 dynamite, you suffer damage to yourself. Because each player has their own specific character, which is like a Wild West, like somebody that's really famously known in like Wild West lore. And they will have a certain health, right? A certain maximum health threshold and specific player powers that make them unique from everybody else. And as the game goes along, you're going to be incurring damage and taking damage, and you're going to be rolling for beer to help you heal from that damage. But again, dynamite make you self-inflict damage to you. Really cool game, fun. It plays in about 15 minutes, maybe even less. And you get that full experience, and you want to play it all over again. My #5, Bang the Dice game. Now we move on to my #4 Wild West themed game of all time, and that is Deadwood. And this game here, it's published by Dust Games and Fantasy Flight, at least this edition is. And it's designed by Loic Lamy. And this game, I believe, is out of print. I had to buy this used, but I got a pretty good copy in decent condition for a good price. And this is a worker placement game where basically players are building the city of Deadwood. The board starts with 4 buildings to start off with. You got your town hall and your sheriff's office and a couple other buildings. I think the church is immediately available. And as the game progresses, you're taking actions that are first of all, benefiting you, getting money, because money is the victory point condition in this game. And also, you're building other buildings and expanding the city of Deadwood. And each of these buildings give you different abilities, right? Most buildings give you money in one shape or form, right? But they also have an additional benefit that you get every time you place your workers there. And what's interesting is you have 9 potential workers to work with in the game. You start off with 3 in your ranch, and as the game goes along, you're trying to gain more into your ranch from the main supply, because the other 6 workers, until they're in your ranch, are not eligible for you to use. And each of the characters has a different value, ranging from 1 through 3. And that's relevant for dueling, because this, like many Wild West themed worker placement games, if you place your worker where somebody else has their worker, you trigger a duel, and you will roll dice to combat for that spot. And basically, again, the value of your character, of your worker there, determines how many dice you roll. And what's crazy is when you lose, not only do you leave the spot, but you're dead. That's a character. That's one less worker you have to deal with for the rest of this game. This game is really neat because basically there's 3 end game triggers. You have the running out of wanted posters. Every time you initiate a duel, the player who initiated the duel will gain a wanted poster. When that supply runs out, that triggers the end of the game. The second way the game is triggered, the end game is triggered, is if one player loses all of their characters. There's no elimination in this game. If you lose all your characters, the game is over for everybody. And third, if the train station, which is one of the buildings, is built. And the train station cannot be built for a certain point, because you need 4 railroad tracks before you can finally build that railroad station. So it'll take some time. So you got to keep your eye on all 3 of these potential end game triggers as you make your decisions, or else the end of the game can sneak up on you. Fun little lighthearted Wild West themed game with some really great implementations and integration of the theme. My number 4 Wild West themed game, Deadwood. Now we move on to my number 3, and this one is none other than Tiny Epic Westerns. And this game doesn't get love from lots of other people, but I really like it. It's actually perhaps my favorite Tiny Epic game. Basically, this is another worker placement game where the game board consists of 6 different locations, and each of those locations have 1 or more worker placement spots where you can place your worker. And basically, what these spots give you are resources. There's 3 resources in the game. You have gold, you have law, and you have power. Or forts, I should say, forts. And you're trying to balance all of these resources because they're going to help you build different buildings throughout the game. Again, you're building buildings, expanding a city. So each of these spots gives you potential resources. However, some spots give you a lesser amount of resources right then and there. Other spots give you more resources, but you have to be the only player standing on that spot when we get to the resolution phase of that round. Because again, like many other Wild West themed worker placement games, an opponent can place their worker where one of your opponents is already located and triggers a duel. And in this game, you get the wanted poster whenever you win a duel. However, in this game, wanted posters are good. They actually give you 2 victory points, which in this game is a lot of points. So you trigger a duel and players combat, and whoever loses the duel is laid down flat to indicate that they're not going to benefit from any long-term benefit that position or that spot that they placed their worker on would have given them. But they can still compete for that building, for that location's building later on, because at the end of each round, whoever has the best poker hand is going to get a benefit from that location, because you're also playing poker along with worker placement. Each of these locations is surrounded by 1 poker card on each of the 2 sides. So there's 2 poker cards visible representing each location, and you have a hand of 1 poker card, and you're basically playing 3-card poker. And whoever has the best poker hand in that location is going to benefit from the poker jackpot. There's a poker jackpot on each of these buildings. And what they give you is additional resources of gold, force, and law, right? So you get the basic resources from your initial worker placement, and then you get the potential bonus from the jackpot of the poker if you have the best poker hand in that spot. So you're kind of factoring in lots of things. You're thinking, as you make your decisions, you're thinking, well, I really want the resources from this location, but I also know that I have very little to no chance of winning the poker hand based on the one card I have and the two other visible cards I see. I have very little chance of winning that poker hand. So I might be better off over here, where I might not be as interested in the resource it provides, but I look at my hand and I see I have a better chance of winning the poker jackpot over here, and also gaining the building card over there. So at the end of each round, players are each going to buy one building if they can afford to, spending the resources that they've acquired to build one of these buildings. And basically the buildings score you based on their symbols, because there's 3 different industries and you're trying to have the majority, or at least the secondary, depending on the player count, in each of these 3 different industries. And at the end of the game, each of these industries is going to have a different individual value. One is going to be the number 1 ranked industry, so it's going to get you more points, and the others will be number 2 and 3, and they'll give you lesser points. So you kind of have to factor that all in. And intrinsically, each building gives you a numbered amount of victory points, right? It gives you anywhere from 1 to, I believe, 4 different victory points intrinsically. And then on top of it all, it gives you those symbols that you will total up at the end of the game to see who has the majority and secondary in each of these industries. Really cool. It incorporates so many things that I appreciate. You have an area majority kind of stock market feel to the game. You have worker placement, which I truly enjoy. And then you have poker hand. And poker, to me, when it's implemented smoothly into a bigger board game experience, is something that I really appreciate. I've always had a fondness for poker, you know, an appreciation for it as a classic game. And again, when you can incorporate it into a bigger board game experience, it's something that I tend to enjoy. My number 3 Wild West themed board game, Tiny Epic Western. And now we're on to our top 2. And my number 2 is Carson City, the card game. And this is the smaller card implementation of Carson City, the board game, which I do own, but I have not gotten to the table yet. This game is neat. You're building your part of Carson City. And basically, throughout the game, players are drafting these cards right here, which have 4 different spaces, and each of these spaces has a different terrain feature or building. For example, you could have mountains, you could have empty space. Some of these have mines or other types of buildings. And basically, you're creating your own imaginary 8x8 grid, and each of these spots represents one spot of that 8x8. So you're working, you're working with this imaginary spatial area and manipulating your cards accordingly and efficiently to get as many points as possible. And the way you score is the different buildings score you points for the different features within your part of the city. They score you points for buildings that might be adjacent to them or other buildings of that same type that might be within the entire framework of your 8x8 grid. Really, really cool city building feel to this game. You're drafting the cards and trying to see where you could place them. And another neat thing about this game is the draft itself is kind of like a trick-taking game, because each player has their own hand of 9 cards ranging from 1 through 9, and each player has their own individual suit, and you're placing your card face down, and then all players reveal it simultaneously and sees who bid the highest ranked card, and it's based on that, it'll determine the priority or the order for drafting the available cards for that round. And it's really cool because there's an automatic tiebreaker. Each round's going to have a different tiebreaker because, again, each player has their own suit. And each round, the number 1 suit on the priority list is going to change. So you got to factor that into your probability of, will I win the bid this round? You also have some character cards that you're also going to be drafting occasionally. And these character cards also can give you victory points, and they give you some benefits that you can capitalize, or abilities that you can capitalize on 1 or 2 times throughout the course of this game. Now, what's very interesting about this game is that it has potential automata or AI players, artificial intelligence, because when you're playing with anything less than 4 players, you need to make up for those players. So if you're playing a 3-player game, you need to throw in 1 dummy player. And it has a really nice and efficient system for that dummy player to execute their turns. And you could play this game solo with 3 dummy players, and it feels just as real as you're facing human competition. Just as tense, just as tight, just as competitive and cutthroat as if you're facing human players, albeit programmed players that you know what decisions they're gonna make ahead of time. Really, really fun, really, really neat implementation. Like this game a lot. Can't get enough of it as a solo or a multiplayer experience. It's a fun one. Number 2, Carson City, the card game. And finally, my number 1 Wild West theme game is none other than Dice Town, designed by Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Mablanc, published by Madigo Games. I cannot get tired of this game. Simple dice rolling game where each side of your dice has a different poker card on it. You could have, 10 spades, or the nine of spades, the 10 of hearts, the jack, the queen, the king, and the ace. And basically you have all these locations in Dice Town that give you different benefits. And each of those locations require for you to have the majority in one of those poker cards. And if you have the majority in that poker card, you go to that location and you capitalize on its benefit. Finally, you have the mayor, which is at the far end of the city, Dice Town. And if you have the best overall poker hand with your dice, then you get to draft one or more property cards. And the property cards are the most efficient way of scoring points in this game. Although you can score points in many other ways, by getting gold from the gold mine, by robbing the bank for its money, by getting cards, special items from the general store. These are all other ways that you could get victory points. Now, I like to play this with the Wild West expansion, which basically adds a second benefit to each location. Because what happens is sometimes you're competing with an opponent to have the most in one area, let's say the gold mine, and by the end of your turn, you realize I did not win the gold mine, the other players did, and now I invested my whole turn into the gold mine. I have nothing else to show for it. I got to go to Dr. Bad Luck, which is like a consolation prize, and get some benefit from it. However, with this game, each location has a second potential option. So if you did not get the most in a particular card, you can still vie for second place in that location in town and get the secondary benefit from it. Really, really cool. It does add some length to the game, but it also makes the game feel like a richer game. It feels like a richer experience. And by richer, I mean wealthier experience, because players are building more wealth, because even being second place in a location is very, very helpful. Maybe not the expansion you want to play with all the time, because again, it does add some to the game length, but for every once in a while, when you're up for a little bit of a longer game of Dice Town, the Wild West expansion is the way to go. Love this game, fun game, love playing with my nephews and my niece. My number 1 Wild West themed board game of all time, Dice Town. And that's it, folks. That's it for today. Those are my top 10 Wild West themed board games. Really quickly, Carson City, the board game, which I mentioned, is a game that I look forward to playing, so hopefully in the near future. Another game I do not own, but is definitely on my wish list or my bucket list, is Western Legends. Very popular Wild West theme game in recent years, and that's one that I definitely have to add to my collection. But for now, these are really good games that I've had enjoyable experiences with. Tell me down below in the comment section, what's your favorite Wild West theme game? Do you like Wild West theme games at all? Or do you feel like maybe they're a little bit overrated or a little played out? I'm interested in your opinions. I'd like to hear what you have to say. And don't forget to subscribe down below as well. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. I'm Harry, once again, saying stay safe, everybody, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.